All right. Hey everyone. Another mini lesson time. All right.
Yay.
So today we're going to learn about screw joints and axles. This one will be a bit of a shorter one, so hopefully you guys can work on your robots. But yeah, let's get into it. So today we're going to go over some axle fundamentals and applications, low strength versus high strength axles, screw joint fundamentals and applications, and then finally some, actually we're not going to go over friction reduction techniques, but hopefully we can get to that. So very quickly, axle fundamentals. So everybody knows what an axle is, right? It's one of these things. They're like square and they're made out of metal. So these are very simple because you can simply put one of these on a motor. It interfaces really well, and you can mount different things on it to help them rotate. So these newer versions have these bigger holes. So what you need is like one of these low strength inserts that you can put in. And basically this allows you to essentially connect the motor power to this axle. So you can hear it, the sound, right? So now you can spin this, and that would be powered by the motor. So pretty simple, right? Next thing is that it's really easy to rotate multiple things on the same axle. If you have, say for example, you have a gear and you also want to rotate, say a wheel on the same axle, it's really easy to do because it's all on the same square axle, and that allows them to turn together. So for example, you can see here. So because they're all connected on the same axle, and because the axle has like a square shape, anything that's connected to the axle with that same square shape can turn together. So this motor would be able to power both of these mechanisms at the same time. So the interesting thing about axles is that they need two things. The first thing they need is one of these. So these are bearings. You can see them everywhere. They're used a lot. Essentially, this allows the axle to be centered within one of these holes. So for example, if we had to put it in a hole where you see one of these regular holes, it would be able to move around, and that's really bad in terms of good build quality. So you need one of these bearings, and that allows the axle to spin smoothly, and it doesn't move around as much, and that allows it to reduce friction. But this adds a lot of weight to the robot, right? Because you have to have 2 more extra screws, 2 extra nuts, and a bearing, and that makes using axles a lot heavier than an alternative, which I'll talk about later. Additionally, if you want to keep an axle from not sliding out, you need one of these. These are collars. So without a collar, right, when you have an axle, you can see how it slides in and out. And you don't want that, because if you have something that's, for example, your drivetrain, right? If it's turning and the axle falls out, and then your gear falls out and your drivetrain no longer works. So you need one of these collars here. Essentially what this does, it clamps onto the axle with this screw. And now you can see that even if I pull it this way, you're unable to take out the axle. It's because this is preventing it. So you can see here that once you screw in this collar over here, if you try to pull out the axle this way, it doesn't work because this prevents it from sliding out. So that's something interesting to note. And also the addition of these just makes it heavier, like I said. So these shafts, using an axle requires a lot of additional hardware in the form of bearings and collars to make it work. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I mentioned really earlier that it connects with motors really easily. As you can see in the motor here, I don't know, this is a little small, but over here you can see how they have already square holes built into these motors. So you can very easily connect axles like this, and that is really easy to interface. So there's 2 main types of axles. So you have the regular low strength axle, and then you have the pretty beefy high strength axle. These are really hard to bend. And so high strength axles are obviously heavier and more robust. So you obviously don't want to make your robot heavier just because. So you want to always use low strength axles when you can. So how do we decide whether we want to use a high strength axle? So the first thing, I created this handy little flow chart over here. So first of all, are we having it support a heavy or large mechanism? So for example, if we have a lift connected to it, that requires a lot of weight, and that's a lot of weight put in on the axle. And with a smaller axle, because it's so thin, it can bend really easily. So we want to make sure to avoid that. So if we have a heavy or large mechanism mounted on it, we want to use a high strength axle. If not, we want to go to the next part. So does it have to withstand a lot of torque? So if you have, we went over torque, I think last week. If we have a lot of torque on an axle, that can actually bend these. So if we have high torque applications on an axle, we want to use one of these, which are a lot harder to twist and break. And if the answer to that is still no, then do we need a long axle? So the longer an axle, the easier it is to bend because you have a longer distance. So if you have a very long distance, you need to connect with a single axle. It's a much better and safer bet to use a high strength axle that is much harder to bend. And if to all those questions the answer is no, then you're fine to use a low strength axle. It should work for most applications. For these high strength applications as listed here, you want to go with the high strength option. So I want to transition very quickly to screw joints. So does anyone here know what a screw joint is yet? If not, totally okay, just wondering. Nope, all right, it's all good. So these screw joints are very simple. So they're constructed using A, a screw, B, a caps nut, which is shown here and also on here, and then 3, a nylock nut, which is right here, and you cap it on to prevent anything from sliding out. So the very interesting thing about screw joints here is that it allows objects to be free spinning. And this can be done in 3 ways. I'll show you guys in the most simplest way here. So if we use one of these brass inserts, you can see how they have an outside square hole and then an inside circular hole. If you put one of these, you can see how it spins, right? And this is because the circular hole allows it to essentially turn on the screw with that instead of an axle. So when you have an axle, it turns the actual axle along with the stuff that you mount on it. A screw joint is different because it actually turns, say this here, independently from the actual screw, and that allows for a lot of friction reduction, which I'll get into. So there's 3 ways that we can do this. First is this brass insert that I showed you. The second is using these inserts over here. And so these are essentially the same thing. They slot into here. Put this in here. Come on. There we go. And these slot onto here, and they achieve the same thing. You see, this is the exact same thing. And then the third option, this one's a little bit more advanced, but if you use one of these spacers, these are some special spacers. We don't usually have these on our lab. We had to order these specifically for this. But essentially, these are able to slot onto these screws, but they're also able to hold. So these are also able to hold these and slot onto these. So this is the least friction out of all of them because they're made out of nylon, which is a very minimally frictious material. So you can see how this spins for quite a long time. And that's a way that we can reduce friction. And so compared to axles, because axles, you have to have the axle spin with the bearing here, right? So that creates a lot of friction because, as shown in this diagram, you have 4 points of contact and there's a little bit of wiggle room, and that basically just makes spinning it at fast speeds quite difficult. By contrast, as shown over here, by using a spacer, because it's a circle on a circle, it can spin a lot easier, as shown by this. So that is just something you want to keep in mind. So if you want to go for something that reduces a lot of friction, that needs to spin very quickly without a lot of friction, you might want to consider using something like a screw joint to help you with that. And finally, this can't be used with a motor. So if you have a motor, you can see we had a square hole. That worked perfectly fine with our square axles, but since screws are round, it doesn't really interface well. So that's just something to keep in mind. So if you're trying to connect the motor directly to something that's spinning, you can't use a screw joint for that. So I want to go over 2 more advanced screw joint mounting techniques that we can use. The first one is, so actually, before we go over that, can you guys tell me what's the problem with mounting 2 things on the same screw joint if you want to get them to spin together? So say something like this, right? Because it's round, right, you can see that they spin independently, right? And that's a problem if we want them to spin together, because when you have an axle, they spin together fine. But when they're on a screw joint, because they're both on a circle, because they're both on a circle, which is a screw, you can see how they can be independent from each other, and that is difficult when you want them to spin together. So one of the techniques to solve this is to simply bolt the 2 together. So I don't have any screws here, but as you can see, we have the screw joint going over here. This is a picture of our drivetrain. We see that we have these screws going through the gear and wheel to bolt them together, and that allows them to spin together, because otherwise they would just spin independently. So that's one of the techniques you can use. The second technique is a little bit more difficult, so I wanted to break it down. So we have our screw joint structure here, so we have our screw going through. We have our caps nut to hold the screw in place, and then we have the nylock nut at the end to hold everything in the screw joint. So that is our basic screw joint. So how do we, what's all this stuff in the middle? So first, we have one of these inserts that basically slot into one side of the sprocket, which offsets these brass inserts in here. And you can see how, because the brass inserts are offset from the sprockets and the flex wheel, that they turn together. So for example, if we have, let's see if I can demonstrate this. So if we have one brass insert per mechanism here, you can see that they can spin independently, right? But if you put one of these circular inserts into one of the sides, let's see. Oh gosh. I'm going in. Hold up, give me a second. Alright, so if we have one of these circular inserts, right? And you can put this in, so this one's perfectly fine. But we have one of these brass inserts that we put in here, right? You can see because they're not aligned together now, so when you put something like a wheel together, you can see that they spin together. And that's because they are connected through here, and so the break points between the sprockets and the break points between the brass inserts are misaligned, and that allows them to spin together. So that's something interesting. And so the whole point is to get the sprockets and the flex wheel to spin together, and this technique allows us to do that. So to close off this lesson, I wanted to go over both the screw joints and axles, and if you're not sure which one to use for what application, this should help you. So the thing about screw joints is that, as I mentioned, they can't connect to motors. So if you're trying to connect something directly to a motor, that won't work with a screw joint. Axles, on the other hand, can connect really easily to motors. So that's something to keep in mind. Screw joints, as demonstrated with that spacer, they allow for reduced friction. So if you're looking for something that has to spin really fast without a lot of friction, this is a good choice compared to axles, which have a lot more friction. These are also more lightweight because, as mentioned earlier, with these axles, you have the collars and also the bearings, so that also adds extra weight to it. And also, finally, with the screw joints, it's hard to connect multiple spinning objects together. As I mentioned, we had two techniques to do that, but in those cases that those don't work, you should go with an axle because it's just a lot simpler in that factor. That's about it for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to approach me after the lesson. Thank you.